afternoon. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Irish Studies Program and the Centre for Irish Programs to a continuation of our Ireland and the British Empire series, which is in many ways the talking book version of the hard copy of that same name, edited by our own Kevin Kenny. The governor has declared a state of emergency today, and the mayor has asked all non-essential people, workers, to stay at home. So here we are.
We're obviously essential.
We are you stole my most carefully crafted. It's nice to know we're essential, isn't it? And it also proves that Irish Studies has the same, I'm not sure it's ethical standing, but we are like the Postal Service. We will not be deterred. It's my special pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Thomas Bartlett. Tom holds the chair of Modern Irish History at University College Dublin. He was formerly associate professor at University College Galway, and he has held a number of visiting professorships at places like Michigan, Notre Dame, and the University of Washington at Seattle. And most recently, he was the Parnell Fellow in Irish Studies at Cambridge University. And he's published very widely in Irish history. His book, The Fall and Rise of the Irish Nation, The Catholic Question, 1690 to 1830, is an essential work on that era, and something that all my students have to work with. He's also, with Keith Jeffreys, published A Military History of Ireland. And on his last visit here to Boston College, at least I think it was your last visit, Tom, he was here as part of the official bicentennial celebration of the rebellion of 1798. And he has been a major contributor to our understanding of that most important event in Irish history. In addition to his role in the official commemoration, he has produced a short but very important biography of Wolfe Tone and a complete and restored edition of Tone's life that was first published in Washington in 1826. That new edition is a major contribution to the field. Most recently, he has published a volume of letters of the 1798 informer, Francis Higgins, also known as the Sham Squire. That volume is entitled Revolutionary Dublin, The Letters of Francis Higgins to Dublin Castle, 1795 to 1801. And he is currently writing a history of Ireland for Cambridge University Press. So obviously there are very few people who could have better credentials to explore this topic today, which is Ireland and the British Empire of 1690 to 1800. But equally important, Tom is one of those scholars who makes working in 18th and early 19th century Irish history an enjoyable experience. In a robust field, Tom has been a great support to other scholars and an anchor of reasoned discourse. It's a great pleasure to give you Professor Tom Bartlett. Tom.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I recognized myself. I'd like to begin by thanking all those responsible for inviting me to come here to speak to you. I was very pleased to be asked. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm sorry that we didn't get the record for the most snow, which would have made the trip utterly memorable. It is already going to be memorable, but it would have been utterly memorable. What I want to talk about is not so much the talking book aspect of it, so people can feel free to leave now. If you want to read the book, you can read the chapter, I want to talk about a few aspects of the chapter. And roughly what I've entitled the paper is Ireland, Empire and Union. And what I'll be focusing on, I suppose, is the way that the imperial argument came into the whole argument for Ireland to join in a legislative union with Great Britain in 1799-1800. But first, let's get a look at some context. Ireland's position within the old British Empire was profoundly ambiguous. The country was admittedly England's oldest colony, but she had been held rather than wholly governed since the 12th century. Moreover, since 1541, Ireland had constituted a kingdom in her own right, and in addition, from medieval times had possessed a parliament, consisting of a House of Commons and a House of Lords. Consequently, as a kingdom with a parliament, Ireland was marked off decisively from every colony subsequently acquired by England, all of which retained their colonial status and could only boast of assorted assemblies, councils and courts, none of which had parity to a parliament. Ireland's proximity to England was also a complicating factor. As an island lying closely off a larger island, itself located just off continental Europe, her geographical position meant that the 18th century colonial stereotypes, extreme temperatures, exotic produce, curious animals, slavery, distance from a mother country, none of these stereotypes were applicable, in fact were conspicuously lacking. To paraphrase the great imperial historian V.T. Harlow, his question, was there a place for a colony on the doorstep of the mother country? And if Ireland was not a colony, could two kingdoms, adjacent to one another and under the one king, coexist in the one empire? There was yet a further difficulty. Unlike other colonies in the Atlantic world, Ireland's position in the 18th century resolutely resists simple categorization into colonizer and colony. Religion, not national origins or skin colour, was to be the great divide. But this was not a simple bipolar Catholic-Protestant division, for the presence of large numbers of Presbyterians, possibly a majority of Irish Protestants by 1750, was a hugely complicating factor. Furthermore, the empire was by no means static in the 18th century, but was instead growing in importance, materially, territorially, and culturally, of course. Ireland, contrary to an earlier historiography, the writings of earlier historians, I think did reasonably well out of imperial trade and out of the empire. And there is some evidence that there was an appreciation of further benefits which would flow from a closer imperial association. And I elaborate on this point in the chapter in the book. It may also be noted, though, that there was resentment that Ireland was not gaining sufficiently from her involvement in the empire. And perhaps curiously, at least one strand in the separatist impulse in Irish nationalism can be traced, notably in Theobald Wolfe Tone's writings, to the conviction that while Irish blood was vital in winning colonies, Ireland herself derived little recognition or acknowledgement for the sacrifice. Tone seems to have imagined that an Ireland, separate from and independent of England, would be able to found her own colonies abroad. Hence his interest in the Sandwich Islands and military colonies in present-day Hawaii and so on. The 18th century witnessed a huge territorial expansion of the empire. Canada and India, with their ethnically and religiously mixed populations, were two massive acquisitions gained as a result of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, 1756 to 63. However, the need to garrison these far-flung possessions placed huge strains on existing military resources. The consequent need for large numbers of new recruits to be drafted into the armed forces of the Crown, and it placed question marks against traditional exclusionary policies. Put bluntly, what I mean is that Irish Catholics had been regarded by Dublin and London as the enemy up to the 1760s, to be kept out of the armed forces at all costs. But thereafter, largely as a result of the expansion of the empire, they were viewed, at least in London, as a reservoir of recruits whose leaders' goodwill might be well worth purchasing through timely concessions on the penal laws. Now, it was anyone's guess what effect this new departure would have on the rigidly segregated Irish political world. The expansion of the empire then placed a strain on Anglo-Irish relations. But so too, curiously, did its contraction. With the secession of the 13 colonies as they drift away off into the horizon, with the secession of the North American colonies and the setting up of a Republic of the United States, Ireland's position in the empire was altered quite fundamentally. For British politicians, the loss of the 13 colonies concentrated attention on how not to lose Ireland. While I think the loss of 13 assemblies in the 13 colonies which set up the United States left the Irish Parliament dangerously exposed within the empire. Shorn of its sheltering sister institutions in the American colonies, the Irish Parliament's anomalous position after 1783 was laid bare. And despite its new powers extorted during the American War, a huge question mark had been placed against its future. By the end of the 1790s, Ireland's role in the empire and Irish attitudes towards that evolving empire had changed dramatically. And similarly, in London, under the impact of all-out war with revolutionary France, an imperial strategy was being formulated, one which would place a premium on central direction, unified authority, and a single general staff, and one in which there was no place for an independent Irish Parliament, querulous and quarrelsome. And yet, while a legislative union was increasingly viewed by the British Prime Minister William Pitt and his advisers as the preferred solution to Britain's Irish problem, all talk, or indeed thought of union, with Britain had to be dismissed as premature, for there was no real possibility of the Irish Parliament voting itself out of existence. By the 1790s, the burgeoning self-confidence of the Protestants of Ireland, the enhanced importance of their potent symbol of identity, the Irish Parliament, and their growing identification with Ireland and Irishness had meant that there was no prospect of them giving up that institution, of in effect committing political suicide. Admittedly, the Catholic Relief Act of 1793 had advanced substantially the cause of union in both countries, for the inability of the Irish Parliament to defend the Protestant interest in that respect had then been mercilessly exposed. And certainly from 1793 on, there had been an identifiable pro-union lobby in the Irish Parliament. But the primary difficulty nonetheless remained. The consent of the Irish Parliament would not be forthcoming. At a stroke, the 1798 rebellion changed the prospects for union, and British ministers and their Irish allies hastened to seize the opportunity it offered. The unionist moment had finally come. But it might pass, and there could be no question of leaving the matter until quieter times prevailed. It was vital to act, wrote one unionist, quote, while the terror of the late rebellion is fresh. And George III signalled his agreement for, quote, using the present moment of terror for frightening the supporters of the castle into a union. Accordingly, the new Lord Lieutenant, the Marquis Cornwallis, and his Chief Secretary, the Irish-born Lord Castlereagh, were entrusted with a dual mandate, first to crush rebellion, and then to put through a legislative union. What was a union between Ireland and England supposed to accomplish? As Pitt saw it, his proposed union would give the perfect riposte to those who had, in the United Irish Rebellion, sought separation. And to that extent, union could be promoted as a key instrument of counter-revolution, a vital strategic imperative which would draw England and Ireland closer and closer together, so as to frustrate those Irish Jacobins and their French allies who had sought to prise them apart. In addition, on a constitutional level, union could be seen as the final solution to those problems that had been, in Pitt's view, bedeviling Anglo-Irish politics since 1782, if not indeed since 1692, when an Irish Parliament had first begun to sit regularly. In particular, Pitt would stress the profoundly unsatisfactory nature of the so-called Constitution of 1782, the willful failure to reform it in the 1780s, and hence the ever-present danger of a clash between two so-called independent legislatures, a clash which Pitt claimed was only narrowly averted at the time of the Regency crisis, when the Irish Parliament had intervened in the appointment of a regent during George III's incapacity. Furthermore, Pitt claimed that it was only in a united Parliament that the Catholic question could be solved in such a way as to gratify the political ambitions of Irish Catholics without endangering the position of Irish Protestants. Indeed, it was only in a united Parliament that certain knotty problems to do with tithes, or education, or payment of priests could be effectively tackled. And there were other benefits which Pitt assured fellow MPs would stem from union. Ireland would gain commercial advantages, money would flow into the country, and there would be an infusion of English capital, English manners, English industry, so that Ireland would prosper from union with England as much as Scotland had done since her union of 1707. But so far, I suppose, so commonplace, for such arguments by and large had been well rehearsed over the previous decades. But Pitt and those who thought like him also stressed the advantages which Ireland and the Empire would derive from a closer incorporating union. And the imperial theme in the debates over union may be worth elaborating on. Now, hitherto, empire, whether as term or concept, had scarcely entered into the lexicon of those in favour of union. There was a unionist pamphlet, that is a pamphlet urging union, published in 1751. And I think it was typical in that there was no mention of any imperial dimension at all. Instead, the author of a proposal for uniting the kingdoms of Great Britain stressed the general utility of a union and claimed that it would pluck Ireland out of the obscurity in which she then languished. Quote, "At present, Ireland hath no character nor even a name in the affairs of Europe. Union would change that." Insofar as empire was cited and is mentioned, the term appears to have denoted a mere trade arrangement. But herein lay a difficulty, for by the 1790s, Ireland could be said to have obtained as much commercial advantage as she could from our plantations in America, as the Irish customs official called them, and from other colonies further afield. It will be remembered that in 1779, restrictions on Irish trade within the Western Empire had been removed, but less well known is the fact that bit by bit, and certainly by 1793, Ireland had gained access to the lucrative East Indian trade. It was a major worry for those politicians, those British politicians, anxious to promote the idea of union in the years 1798 to 1800, but really Britain had few commercial advantages left to offer in return for Irish agreement. And this, of course, was in marked contrast to that trading partnership within the Empire held out to the Scots in 1707, an offer which had played a major role in inducing them to support the Anglo-Scottish Union. However, the fact that Britain had little left to give in terms of access to imperial trade did not mean that imperial matters were ignored in the Union debates. On the contrary, the prospect of a strengthened empire, the notion of an imperial partnership, and the idea of an union for empire were held out to Irish Protestants as key inducements to give up their parliament. The imperial theme was set from the beginning. For Lord Cornwallis, the Viceroy, the essential backdrop to union was, quote, "the general cause which engages the empire and the compelling need to strengthen the empire in the face of French aggression." For Castlereagh too, a union would, quote, "consolidate the strength and glory of the empire," though he rather went on to spoil matters by tactlessly raising the question of Ireland's imperial contribution in claiming that Ireland's colonial trade was a matter of right, not of right, but of favour. And these, of course, were touchy subjects with Irish MPs. Other Irish pro-unionists took up this theme of a union for empire, though here the emphasis was on the threat posed by an independent Irish Parliament to imperial unity. Thomas Connolly pointed out that, quote, "two independent legislatures in the one empire were as absurd and monstrous as two heads on one pair of shoulders," while the young lawyer William Smith argued that only a legislative union could ensure that one empire shall no longer be exposed to the risk of wavering languidly and inertly between the dissentient systems of two parliaments. It was, however, William Pitt in the British Parliament who spelled out in detail what might be called the imperial argument. For Pitt, the ongoing war with France was, quote, "the most important and momentous conflict that had ever occurred in the history of the world, and the fate of the British Empire hung in the balance. A union with Ireland, which he called that mighty limb of empire, would increase the general power of the empire to a very great extent by a consolidation of the strength of the two kingdoms." Especially, William Pitt held out the exciting prospect of the creation of an entirely new assembly, one that would be neither British nor Irish, but instead would be, quote, "a general imperial legislature, an institution which, free alike from terror and from resentment, removed from danger and agitation, and uninflamed by the prejudices and passions of that distracted country, Ireland, would adjudicate impartially and disinterestedly on those vicious issues that had riven Ireland for years and had left her so exposed to French intrigue." Pitt's remarks were echoed by his colleagues. Dundas, his Minister at War, identified the prevalence in Ireland of, quote, "new doctrines so dangerous to the existence of all regular governments and thus consequently so dangerous to that of the empire, which made union necessary." And he forecast that after union, the voice of Irishmen would be heard not only in Europe, but in Asia and Africa and America. The former Irish Chief Secretary, Douglas, another Scot, dismissed the argument that post-Union Ireland would suffer a loss of constitutional status by arguing that, quote, "Ireland by an union no more becomes a province in any offensive sense of the word than Great Britain. They both become provinces or component parts of one whole and integrated empire." And, obviously unconsciously echoing Theobald Wolfe Tone, Douglas pointed out that currently Ireland cannot either plant a colony or establish a foreign settlement. He and Dundas agreed that union would give Ireland both a new role and a new voice in the empire. Another Scot, Lord Minto, made the conventional point that a union with Ireland would afford an occasion of real and efficient force to our present empire as a naval and military power. But he then went on to consider the wider imperial dimension. The only connection Ireland had with England, he claimed, was an imperial one, and it was this, quote, imperial connection which makes Ireland a member of the noblest empire of the globe. In his view, the proposed union was simply building on that foundation. For what, after all, is this imperial connection, in the necessity of which we are all agreed? If it be anything more than a name, and if it afford any substantial advantage, does it not consist in securing a conformity, or rather a perfect uniformity and unity in the councils of the two countries on affairs of imperial concern? And again, in terms that recall Theobald Wolfe Tone's strictures on Ireland's poor imperial performance, Minto depicted the harsh reality of Ireland's current imperial role. Currently, Ireland cannot, by the utmost success of the war, acquire an acre of new territory to the Irish Dominion. Every acquisition made by the forces of the empire, however great Ireland's share may have been in the danger or exertion, accrues to the crown of Great Britain. If an island were taken by regiments raised in Ireland and composed wholly of Irishmen, and by ships manned altogether by Irish seamen, that island is a British conquest, not an Irish one. He promised that all this would change following union. For Theobald Wolfe Tone, Ireland's inability to acquire overseas possessions was an argument in favour of separation. For Minto, it was a key argument in favour of union. After union, Minto concluded, Ireland is still Ireland, while a new scope is given to the pride and a larger field open to the patriotism of every Irishman. Beyond the walls of the Irish and British parliaments, pro-union pamphlet writers took up and elaborated this theme of a union for empire. Archibald Redford wrote of the powerful tendency of union to give the British Empire strength and stability, and he reassured doubtful Protestants that it would be a Protestant empire, one which would have an overwhelming majority of Protestants within the imperial state. Or as another writer had it, by a union the majority of the empire will be Protestant, and they have the right and the power to fix the national religion. Another writer, named An Orangeman, stressed the career opportunities at the heart of the empire that would open after union. Is not Irish genius equal to the task of imperial government? Before going on to point to the glittering examples of Burke and Sheridan and Isaac Barry, imperial statesmen all. Where would we have heard of them had they remained at home to wrangle in the little infantile squabbles of local legislatures? In short, union is pregnant with immense, unequivocal and permanent imperial advantages, and it was only the reformists, republicans and separatists of this time who refused to support it. Now, so common, and it appears so attractive, was this theme of empire in the general union debate, that those who were opposed to union were forced to make an attempt to rebut it. They did so in two major ways. First, some anti-unionist politicians and writers claimed that union would ultimately prove fatal to the empire. Now, admittedly, John Foster, the principal opponent of union in the Irish Parliament, would base his arguments mostly on the grounds that union would be a bad deal for the Irish economy. That was the first ground. And then he would deny that any British Parliament could be trusted to defend the interests of Irish Protestants. But even Foster had to step aside to confront the imperialists. Contrary to what was promised, post-Union Ireland, he claimed, will not be at the heart of empire. Instead, he wrote, we shall become a colony on the worst of terms. He would argue that union was bad for Ireland economically, it would be bad for Irish Protestants to entrust their future to British Protestants, and then he would say that ultimately Ireland's status in the world would not be magnified or increased, it would be diminished. Ireland would be reduced to a colony, as he put it, on the worst of terms. And then he added, exclusive of all its injuries to Ireland, union is big with danger to the old fabric of the British Constitution. That union itself was a danger to the British Constitution. And if the British Constitution falls, the empire goes with it, and they and we and all of us fall down. Foster was concerned that the 100 Irish MPs who would go to Westminster would overset the balance of the Constitution, because they would be little more than ministerial cannon fodder. They would do what they're told. Others as well forecast disaster for the British Empire, for Irish anger at the provocation of union might turn the people towards France. Might not the measure of union drive the people of Ireland, which God avert, to seek protection from our natural enemies, even under a republican form of government? Another author claimed that union could never solve Ireland's religious problems, but on the contrary would prove the means of a final separation. Taking the longer view, Charles Ball found the outcome of union easily predictable. It would ultimately involve this country in the next greatest calamity that could befall it, a total separation from England. And this in turn would lead to the breakup of the empire. All arguments which were heard at the end of the 19th century when the issue of home rule was on the table. A second ground which those opposed to union addressed was that they stressed the fact that English prejudices against the Irish were so inveterate and deep-rooted that union itself was not at all possible. Nor was there any reason to hope for Irish entry into the empire because of this. Anxieties were expressed that Irish orators would not gain a hearing for themselves in the new general imperial legislature. They would be shunned, no one would pay attention. An Irish gentleman, wrote one, quote, smelling of the turf of boggy Ireland, would be ashamed to exhibit the Irish brogue in the British Senate. And in this regard, the cautionary tale of Henry Flood was often cited. Flood was an Irish Demosthenes in Ireland when speaking in the Irish Parliament, but at Westminster, whither he had removed himself in the 1780s, he suffered the humiliation of concluding, quote, a very able and eloquent speech amidst the yawns and coughs of an English Senate. More substantially, English antipathy towards the Irish, it was claimed, was simply too great to be overcome. Quote, we are a savage, immoral, ill-mannered race. I know well such are the sentiments, which wrote one, which the low and vulgar of your country entertaineth the people of Ireland. I am well aware of the rooted prejudices, I'd almost said hatred, that lodges in the breast of some Englishmen towards Ireland. The English have been taught to hate and despise us from their infancy, argued Dennis Taff. So much so that even, quote, the very liberal Englishman cannot but consider the Irish as, quote, semi-barbarous, destitute of industry, punctuality and honesty. Now such naked prejudice on its own, it was pointed out, would stop Irishmen taking up their promised road in imperial direction. And there was more. It was widely agreed, for example, at the time of union, that English politicians and the English public knew little about Ireland and cared less. The lovelessness of the Anglo-Irish relationship had long been evident. At the time of union, the ignorance that underpinned that lovelessness seemed both comprehensive and encyclopedic. Now, the union would give a great fillip to Irish writing, in that it would provide a stimulus to Irish writers to explain their country to the English, to undertake what one has called a kind of advocacy before the bar of English public opinion. But that was work for the future. The Irish novelist, that is, the writer who chose to set his or her stories in Ireland, was at the time of union largely unknown. Admittedly, in 1800, Maria Edgeworth had published that great ornament of Anglo-Irish fiction, Castle Rackrent. But its impact was surely not what she had intended. She had written it as a historical novel, set before the year 1782, with its characters, the Sir Kitts and the Sir Condys, belonging to Ireland's former existence. But her novel was in fact taken as an accurate representation of Irish life at the time of union. None other than George III, destined to play a key role in political events for the next 10 years, valued its insights into the contemporary Irish character. Maria's father, Richard Lovell Edgeworth, claimed that George III, after reading the novel, had then rubbed his hands and said, what, I now know something of my Irish subjects. And the novel's title soon became shorthand for all that was bizarre and burlesque among the Irish governing elite. A year after publication, the newly appointed Chief Secretary, Charles Abbott, on his little tour around Ireland, meeting the people, confided to his boss, Lord Hardwicke, that Abbott's party had, quote, dined one night at a thorough Castle Rackrent, but pray never say so. And again, we come back to those who were deeply sceptical of any Anglo-Irish cooperation, co-prosperity or integration, whether on behalf of Union, Empire or indeed anything else. Dennis Taff, whom we have met before, dismissed out of hand all talk of English manners, English capital, English industry, English culture, pouring down a conduit from London into Dublin and diffusing itself throughout Ireland. Our barbarous poor, he rounded on those who had the impertinence to claim that our barbarous, poor, unpolished people would be refined, etc., by our new intimacy with the elegant, agreeable, social, highly polished English, triple exclamation mark. What strange tales we are destined to hear. To learn good breeding and politeness from the churling, growling, and selfish race of Englishmen. When pressed, Dennis Taff was prepared to concede that in the polite accomplishments of boxing, swearing, gluttony, rudeness, avarice, the English stand unrivaled. And he offered his readers a specimen of their so-called elegant conversation and style, which abounded with such little asides as, "Nay, damn my eyes, God damn my eyes, face and nose, I'll be damned if, God damn my bloody eyes," etc., etc. Such are the flowers, sniffed Dennis Taff, which Irishmen may hope to borrow to adorn our isle. For other Irishmen, there was also a fear, but this time not of English condescension and rejection, but rather of Irish uncouthness being paraded at the centre of empire. The Irish might be let into the Imperial Club, but once their manners and outlook and so on was discovered, they would be quickly kicked out, once their lack of polish was revealed. It was an Irish commentator, not a hostile English observer, who denounced the lack of polish among the Tipperary gentry, who, quote, "consider a steeplechase the noblest work of human ambition, and listen to the yapping of a parcel of curs, hounds, with more pleasure than to the music of Rossini." And consider the revealing thoughts that the fastidious Dennis Scully confided to his commonplace book. We have to remember that at the time of union, it was assumed that there would be a good deal more toing and froing across the Irish Sea. And poor Scully cringed at the unfavourable impression which Irish women would make on their more cultured English cousins. I've often heard Irish ladies who possessed rank or birth or fortune or education, or some or all of these advantages together, express themselves in words which would shock an ear of common delicacy in England, frequently using such words as stinking, dirty, nasty, fat woman, the fellow's carcass, swim in blood, rotten, spit, with 50 other phrases nauseous to recollect, which are in England confined to the drunkard, the debaucher, the butcher and the scavenger. Yet it is a fact that they possess as much native innocence of mind, genuine modesty, and rather more prudery than the English women. And I impute the use of these coarse phrases, which are inconceivably grating to the ear from a female voice, to the ignorance of their mothers in a few instances, but more generally to their shameful neglect of cultivating the style of conversation and many other useful attainments. Scully concluded with the suggestion that Irish women, and I have no idea what is going through Scully's mind, but he concluded with the suggestion that Irish women should substitute, and these words are very suggestive, that they should substitute fetid, rancid or offensive for stinking, soiled for dirty, nasty, large or embonpoint for fat, and putrid, carious or decayed for rotten. Now, these unflattering views of England and English, and of Ireland, its people and its prospects, were quite seriously at odds with the buoyant public message contained in unionist speeches and declarations. The glaring discrepancy between the negative perception of what Ireland was, one shared at both popular and elite levels, and the positive act of seeking to unite with such a benighted, barbaric and regressive country. And in terms of the barbaric point, I may mention that the public prints in England had left nothing to the imagination in their depiction of the excesses, if you like, of the 1798 rebellion. The London Times had carried very many reports detailing the cruelties which had occurred in 1798. So there was no question that this was something from historic memory, this was something which was rather current. All of which appeared to rule out any possibility of a real union for empire, or any likelihood of the emergence of what you might call a shared British identity. Now, of course, notwithstanding all of these sentiments, pro and con, the anti-unionists lost the debate and the union was passed duly. Many factors help explain the passing of the Act of Union, the Irish Act of Union, and these have been well argued and well canvassed in the 200 years since its enactment, 200 and so many years. What may be said is that when linked to empire, the unionist case was certainly an impressive one. The offer of an union for empire struck a chord with the politically involved classes and to an extent forced anti-unionists onto the defensive. Henry Grattan's famous peroration against the proposed Anglo-Irish Trade Agreement of 1785, "Let the Union perish, but live the Constitution," could not be dusted down and redeployed in 1799. Surely a sign that empire was held in much higher regard in 1800 than it had been even 15 years earlier. In the event, while few of the promises held out by unionists were realised in the 100 years after 1800, union did in fact prove to be a gateway to empire. Through the 19th century and beyond, Irish men and Irish women entered enthusiastically into the business of empire, whether as merchants, soldiers, settlers, missionaries, doctors or administrators. The union was to a large extent, I think, religiously blind, at least where Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants were concerned, and both would quickly become eager imperialists, the latter group taking special pride in the heroic deeds of Irish soldiers and the heroic self-sacrifice of Irish priests and nuns. Throughout the 19th century, the empire offered career opportunities, male and female, clerical and lay, that were simply not available in Ireland. Indeed, from the 1830s on, what was called the colonial patronage, that is, the offices which were at the disposal of the colonial secretary, and obviously were in the colonies, was drawn on explicitly to meet the career aspirations of Irish Catholic middle classes who clamoured for tangible benefits from emancipation. The colonies would provide for them. Inevitably, the Catholic Irish nation would have major problems with the Protestant British state in the 19th century. But an appreciation of the benefits of empire meant that Irish protests tended to be circumspect. Both the repeal movement of O'Connell and the Home Rule movement of Parnell and Butt and so on explicitly denied any intention of disrupting the empire. We may conclude that throughout the 19th century, the bond of empire was at all times stronger than that of union. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. Well, let me grab my chance here. It's kind of a very particular question. You mentioned Burke, but only Burke in passing. And of course, Burke doesn't live to actually go on record about the union. But in the chapter in the book, you suggested that he probably would have been in favor of the union. And certainly there are people arguing in favor of the union who declared themselves Burkeans. But I'm wondering how you would envision Burke responding to the extinction of the Irish Parliament. Wouldn't that represent the sort of long evolving organic institution that Burke was so powerfully committed to?
But remember, yeah, I think that's right. One of the problems with Burke, many problems, is that first of all that he's dead before the union is brought forward. He dies in 1797. So what we have to do is to think what he might have done. It's always very unsatisfactory. Burke had no time for the Protestant ruling class in Ireland. He saw them as really a gimcrack aristocracy, sort of jumped up, who had no roots whatsoever and who had resisted all attempts to put down roots into the country. So to sweep them aside would have caused him no problem. For that reason, I felt that he would be very sympathetic to the notion of saying that they were a failed political class and had to be swept aside and their institution had to go with them. I think, though, that Burke would have been particularly interested in the imperial argument because, contrary to other commentators on Burke, I think that Burke saw the empire as a very positive instrument for bringing actual good into the world, but that for various reasons the empire had been corrupted the rise of the East Indian class, the East India Company, the nabobs who were over in India, the various outrages that had taken place. These were the sort of things which exercised him and made him feel that the empire was not delivering. But he still felt that it infused with a proper spirit, I think, that the empire could have delivered good for everyone, I suppose. And in that respect, that's why I argued, very briefly as it happens, that Burke would surely have approved of the argument in favour of union being couched in terms of strengthening the empire, coming up with an entirely new spirit to infuse that empire and to motivate the people involved in it. The sort of stuff that Pitt was going on about in his speech of February 1799, which I quoted from. So that's what I would say.
Well, I have a question too. Tom, one of the most interesting parts of the chapter that you touched on in the talk as well is the American Revolution not only opens up opportunity for Ireland in the short term, it actually closes it down because Ireland becomes an anomaly once the American colonies are gone. And the Act of Union then is a response to that, and a response, I suppose, to 1798. There's a lot of talk around 1800 and again 100 years later about how much this matters, how much union matters to Ireland and to the empire. And the question I have is it's a counterfactual question, so that means it can get any answer one likes. It's in a way not, of no use to a historian, and in other ways the type of question we ask but don't always answer. But what difference do you think it would have made to the empire if, say, if union had failed in 1800?
Well, there's an easy way to answer that, and that is there was no prospect of it failing.
Okay.
I take the sort of straightforward political view that throughout the late 18th century, whenever the British government wanted something big time, it got it. There was just no way out of that. And the classic one would be, prior to this, they want a substantial Catholic relief concession in 1793. This was very much opposed in the Irish Parliament. It gives the vote to Catholics. It's a huge sort of step forward. It brings Catholics within the political arena, and so on. It's absolutely almost a revolutionary proposal, certainly as dramatic as that of O'Connell's 30-odd years later. The British government wants it because it's necessary for strategy. It's necessary to bring Ireland and England together, to get everyone on the one, singing from the one hymn sheet against the French. Similarly, in 1799, Pitt ends his long 3-hour speech and he says words to the effect that, "I see the case so plainly that there's nothing will stop me. No matter how many reverses, it's going to go through. All bets are off, that all services that have been done so far count for nothing. You can have opposed us for 10 years, you could have been on our side. This is where you must now be in favour of union. If you're in favour of union, all sins will be forgiven, all services will be further rewarded." So in that respect, it has to go through. And it sort of, it means that a good deal of the who got what, and the loaves and fishes, and the pensions, the peerages, the titles, is kind of redundant. And the brown envelopes of cash and so on, that's certainly part of the whole. But British determination, the Irish Parliament simply can't withstand that, which shows up just how weak the Irish Parliament is post-1782, as you point out. But say it had been defeated. I think one of the things that the Union, which is not really noted, is that there's an imperial general staff is set up as a result of the Act of Union. There was a separate general staff in Ireland as in England. And while matters were quite straightforward between them, there was always the possibility of some difficulty over strategy, over military strategy. And I think that is something which tangibly comes forward and which is very important in the 19th century. The Imperial General Staff is really the cutting edge of the extension of the British Empire and the defence of the British Empire. And Irish officers and generals are hugely important, hugely disproportionate to the numbers of Irish citizens within the British state at that time. And the Irish Protestant officers are hugely disproportionate as well. So the Union is, in that minor way, I think, is clearly going to be of imperial advantage. The other arguments are that the Irish Parliament, and this is where they draw on the Scottish example, the Scottish Parliament was a waste of time. It's a black hole for negative energy. People spend time trying to get Irish into the Scottish Parliament. They spend money trying. This is money which is wasted. It's energy which is wasted. Similarly, by the 1790s, there's a constituency within Ireland which is arguing that the Irish Parliament was a waste of energy. It was a waste of Irish people's talent to get into it. It advanced nothing. It was negative money. Money was being spent on winning elections, which were pointless. Far better to shift Irish energies to London and beyond London to the India, Canada, and the various islands dotted in between. That I think is the general thinking about the Irish Parliament. I think that's a fair point as well. You know, to go back to Burke, the Irish Parliament might have been there since medieval times, all right, but the Irish ruling class certainly had not been, in his view. The genuine Irish ruling class were those in the Blackwater Valley, his forebears and so on. They were the ruling class who had been sort of knocked down. The Irish ruling class were really the counterparts of Robespierre and the Jacobins in France. And so thus he would have no time for them whatsoever. Somebody at the back there.
You mentioned that union gave the rise to job opportunities for soldiers, sailors, priests, nuns, government workers. Did the people who filled those jobs come from all over Ireland, or mostly from within the former Pale? Or so, in other words, were they from everywhere?
Yeah, I can't honestly say that they're completely everywhere, but certainly that would be my impression. Certainly in Dublin, Trinity College is a huge sort of school for imperial administrators. But in my former university in Galway, I remember going down into the basement of the library there, where all the old books were kept and parading around, and I came across a large number of exam papers for the Indian Civil Service from the 1870s and the 1880s. Galway was founded, I think, in the 1840s, one of the Queen's colleges. And it's clear that Galway was seen as another college into which the Catholic middle class would go, get their training in Sanskrit and how to give commands, and then go off to the Imperial Civil Service. And very many of them do. So much so, the Irish proved to be very adept at passing examinations. I won't say they were more intelligent than everyone else, but they proved very clever at passing exams, with the result that there was pretty much outrage that the system was sort of honest, because the Irish were doing so well at it in the 1880s. Questions were asked in Parliament, the Irish predominance in the civil service intake each year. So, yeah, I think that in terms of career opportunities, the Empire does fulfill its role for soldiers, administrators, and also for women as well. Medical nuns, missionaries. The Empire offers them, in a sense, career opportunities that simply were not available in Ireland at that time, or at least were much more circumscribed in Ireland. Yes?
Yeah, I was actually curious with given that the meaning of empire, or the understanding of empire, is still, I think, pretty much in flux in this period. I mean, it's not a single understanding, right? Is there some way of getting at the question of whether the pro-unionists had a particular view or understanding of the meaning of empire as against the anti-unionists, or was there a very similar sort of variation in the understandings? I mean, were they focused on trade and commerce, or were they focused on the question of government and control? What image of empire did they have? What did they think was going on there?
Well, you're quite correct to say that there is a division between those who see empire purely in trade terms and those who see it purely in dominion terms. The two aren't necessarily exclusive. What is interesting, I think, is that really until the 1790s, empire means trade.
Right.
But then by the late 1790s, really, it seems to me quite quickly, it seems to imply dominion. We have Theobald Wolfe Tone talking about Ireland being frustrated because Ireland wins these territories but cannot hold them because Ireland has no say in the matter. People who argue for union rehearse this argument as well, that Ireland would be able to gain, in a sense, her own colonies, or at least get greater access to colonies. At the moment, she simply does the dirty work, so to speak, and then gets a curt thanks, and that's that. So the notion of dominion, I think, has become something quite current, quite new in Irish discourse, and it's It's seen in the pamphlet literature surrounding the Act of Union, but it's tantalising the way that people, in a sense, pick out any argument which suits their case. I can recall no sort of clearly argued case for union meaning dominion. I can recall a lot of cases where union is necessary to fight Bonaparte, because at the United Empire, the way we are fixed at the moment, we are divided. And they also make the point, don't forget, that what the French are doing is that they are uniting with other countries. The Batavian Republic, the Cisalpine Republic, various republics dotted throughout Europe. The French are united with them. And by 1799, you could argue that the penny had dropped with Britain, that if they wanted to defeat Bonaparte, they had to be like Bonaparte, they had to be like the French, and hence union had to go through. Just as the French are capturing countries and having them as sort of independent satellites or whatever, or rather dependent satellites, so too Ireland had to. Yeah.
Right, but I was actually thinking more in terms of, I mean, I understand the notion of the need for union with Ireland and the idea of the force that comes from increasing territory in a sense, but in terms of their imagining of what they're doing with these foreign lands, right, the distant ones, because my understanding is that even post 1800s, the British government's attitude towards actual dominion in India, for instance, is actually quite ambivalent. I mean, they want to be able to get as much sort of profit out of it, but that means they don't want to be spending a lot of money on the controlling aspect of it. So the ambivalence that is there for quite a long time is persistent, and so I was wondering whether whether at any moment the pro-unionists are thinking of it as to the relationship. I mean, if we're talking about union for empire, is that somehow because they have the idea that it's not about government out there, but about really just getting as much profit, and do the anti-unionists have the understanding that actually it's beginning to look like too much dominion, something like that.
You may be onto something there. My impression is, and that's really all I can say, is that the idea is really that union, the empire, the imperial dimension, was seen very largely in administrative terms, that the prize of union would open administration to Irishmen.
Right.
I mean, the East India Company is very largely a Scottish preserve.
Right.
Irish are hugely underrepresented in it. And this is one of those historic reasons, for historic reasons that is the case. Ireland simply wasn't involved in it. But I think that's the number of Scots who take a major say in the union debates, drawing comparisons with how Scotland flourished and how Ireland would flourish similarly. Scotland in 1707 was poor, backward, and so on. Now Scotland, very much key players in the East India Company, key players in India and other parts of the world. Ireland too could be like that. Irish statesmen, Irish politicians, Irishmen are wasting their time in this backward country, which has nothing going for it. They're wasting their time fighting elections. Come to London, be at the centre, and you too can be an administrator. I'm not certain whether sort of ideas of dominion really account for it in terms of capturing, governing, and controlling.
Right.
But it is that, I think that's what they're pointing. That's what they're pointing to in the pamphlet literature. Ruth Ann?
Yeah, I was thinking one way of approaching that is looking at, say, the influence of the Manchester manufacturers. Was there really a need for raw materials at that time, which implied having to go abroad and so on? I was thinking the economic argument on that, but I'm not sure. I'm trying to think how you'd approach that.
Well, I mean, again, it's work for another day. But one of the things that is very striking is that in the mid 1780s, Pitt comes up with a defence trade pact between Britain and Ireland, and it's drowned out in Irish rhetoric. This was seen as England trying to pull a fast one and all the rest of it, and it just doesn't go anywhere. The manufacturers in England were very much up in arms against the generous terms, as they saw it, which Pitt was offering. And yet in 1799, there's not a great deal of sort of manufacturing complaints about what's on offer in terms of union. That it's almost as if between 85 and 1800, certain things are now commonly understood. Ireland is not a threat to Britain, whereas in 1785, could be portrayed as a threat with cheaper labour, lower wages, lower costs. It could actually perhaps enter into competition, serious competition with the Manchester manufacturers and so on. By 1800 that doesn't seem to be the case, and the notion of it's not so much that Ireland sort of improving her trade, it's that union will enable British manufacturers to invest in Ireland. They are hesitant to do so because of the complicated and uncertain political arrangements in Ireland, and the uncertain constitutional arrangements between Britain and Ireland. Once that's resolved, then English capital will pour into Ireland. And that was the theory at any rate. It doesn't really happen. Rob?
Tom, just a question about what was seen as the second city of the Empire of Dublin. Did the sort of fate of the city enter into any of the arguments about union and what it might mean for the
It
capital?
absolutely does, yeah. It's Dublin is generally opposed to union in terms of the regional pattern of opposition to union. Dublin is opposed. Cork is generally in favour. Galway is in favour. Southern Ulster is opposed, all for various reasons peculiar to those regions. But certainly people do comment that Dublin will become a backwater, a mere fishing village is one of the quotations I recall. That it will lose, it'll bring about the flight of the quality from Dublin. That the luxury trades, the jewellers, the goldsmiths, and so on, silversmiths, simply have no one to cater for, because the centre of the world will now be London, and needless to say, the glittering people will all want to go there. Why stay in Dublin? There's nothing going on. It's one of the reasons why they keep on the Viceroy. I mean, it's a big difference, but one of the big differences between Scotland and Ireland in 1707, there's no Scottish Viceroy. Scots presumably don't need glitter and all the rest of it. But Irish people absolutely have to have display and splendour. And so the Viceroy is kept on so that there can be a viceregal court where you can go for drinks and chat and present your daughter and whatever. That's to keep the natives impressed, awestruck, and so on.
And is there a real decline?
I say this because I can not find any argument as to why a Viceroy was kept on. It just seems to be assumed that he would stay on, and then people say, well, it is useful to have him because it offers display and helps counteract the flight of the quality which would assume would happen from Dublin.
Tom, in the rhetoric on the Irish side of the debate, you made reference to the various ways in which the barbarism of the Irish they were afraid that this would be a real problem for Irish people entering into the Union. Is there much in that discussion? Is there much actual reference to 1798 itself? And to the point you mentioned, the Times being very upfront in representing the horrors of the rebellion. But I'm wondering about on the Irish side whether the trauma of '98 is visible and explicit, or whether it's kept
It's
on the
mostly
background.
Anti-unionists, as far as I recall, bring up 1798, and their point here is that the 1798 rebellion. What did I say? What the point was now? Well, one point that occurs to me now is that the United Irishmen, their name for their organisation was the Union, and they make the point that Union at one time to be in favour of the Union with the level to be transported, but now, because the British minister says so, everyone has to be in favour of the Union. They make points like that. The reason why I'm getting a little bit sort of turned around is that what I thought you were going to ask and what I was going to mention was what I'm trying to work on in terms of these debates is not just for empire and so on, but it has to do with what Kevin said about this notion of Irish barbarism. And really, it's trying to address the question of, was a genuine union possible? Could there have been a possibility of any sort of integration, let alone assimilation? Or was Ireland destined always to be the other in terms of English discourse and English attitudes and so on? Now the context for this debate is the argument by Linda Colley, looking at the origins of Britons and arguing that the Irish could never be British, and that was that because they're Catholic, because they're for and so on. And what I was trying to get at was that possibly at the time of union, there may have been some possibility here. Taft's, the Marie Edgeworths, all of them have a notion that certain things are possible in 1800, which meant that the Irish possibly could have become British, but that didn't happen. And I think that that's a question which is worth contemplating. It's assumed, I think, by most historians that there's no need for that question. It's assumed that the Irish could never have become British, certainly not in 1800. But it seems to me it's still worth asking the question, given the type of rosy and optimistic rhetoric that comes out at the time of union, and then which sort of nosedives within about 5 years, and in which Ireland becomes a country that will be held rather than governed, and in which Ireland is a place, useful for troops and all the rest of it, but not a country with which people are entirely comfortable. Yeah, Vera?
Well, first of all, in 1806, when Sidney Owenson writes her novel, The Wild Irish Girl, you do still have the notion that through cultural encounter, a union of, the hearts, as it becomes the metaphor in her book, can occur. I mean, she's still arguing that, 1806. But the question I had was about the definitions of, how people thought about union, trade, dominion. Was there any sign at that point, 1800, that next decade, of the moral dimension to union that that comes up later on, that in bringing civilization, it ends up with Kipling, The White Man's Burden. Because I came across a little short story by Maria Edgeworth, which is called The Grateful Negro, in which the West Indian slave owner is so exquisitely paternalistic and wonderful that he undermines any movement towards rebellion. And of course, the slave owner is modeled on the Edgeworth notion of really caring for the tenants. And so, that's already beginning, the moral justification of union. You will do it well, and you will take care of these people, and you will not have trouble if you do that.
Right.
So I'm asking if it starts.
Two
other
things.
way.
I would have, when you mentioned 1806, Morgan, still optimistic about the prospects of union. I tend to put it down to about 1803 until Robert Emmet's rebellion, which is that sort of slap in the face for British government. They had talked about British standards, bringing them in, union principles being acted on, and generally the whole notion of that the old pre-union ways of doing things had now been cast aside, that Irish corruption was a thing of the past, that Irish rebels are a thing of the past, that Irish skullduggery and avarice, that's all over. To go boldly go where no one has ever gone before. And then Emmet's rebellion happens, and old Kilwarden is killed in the street and so on. And it's a palpable shock in Dublin. And you see coming back in 1803 the people who had been put out. Sir Richard Musgrave, a crank before 1803, now has vital local knowledge, and he's brought back John Foster, who had been, one of those who had been tormented the pro-unionists with his clever arguments. He had been kept at arm's length. He's brought back. So it's just an interesting, from a historical or literary point of view, but I think what we both agree on is that it is quite early on when the whole, the optimistic scenario begins to darken, perhaps is torn up pretty soon after 1800. And as for the moral dimension, I think that's something which comes much later. It's funny, I was ticked off for saying that Irish hierarchy were in favour of union because they could see a field opening up for missionary activity. And I think I was ticked off quite rightly because I was sure I'd seen a reference to this, but I couldn't find it anywhere. And it seems that it's much later apparently, it's in the 1830s or 40s, possibly in terms of the whole religious revival in England, that Irish Catholics begin to get involved in that as well, in the missionary effort. And so it's almost as if, you know, it's latent in 1800 this could happen, but it's not realised for about 30 years on. And I suspect that's where the moral dimension comes in, along with the anti-slavery campaign, which is reaching a peak at that time in the 1820s. I think that's when that comes in.
Well, I think we've worked hard enough, so I'd like to thank him for presenting today. And we have some refreshments outside so we can continue discussion.